This week, in the city of Kazan, Russia hosted the 2024 BRICS Summit under the theme Strengthening Multilateralism for a Just Global Development and Security. The Kremlin has called it one of the largest scale foreign policy events ever in Russia, with more than 20 heads of state in attendance. The Kazan declaration from the summit reiterated, amongst other things, the principle of African solutions to African problems. So this week on the program, we look at the key outcomes of the summit and what they mean for Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, the three-day BRICS Summit wrapped up on Thursday. Before we begin our discussion, we cross over to my colleague Alyosha Milenkovic for an overview. Welcome to the program, Alyosha, and thank you for joining us. So, start off by telling us, what are some of the key outcomes of the BRICS Summit 2024?
Yes, Beatrice, it was a very interesting summit. It was 16th summit held in Kazan. It was second time that Russia hosted such a big BRICS event on its territory. And the thing is, regarding the entire event, is that it was divided in several elements. The most important one for Africa, of course, was meeting of so-called BRICS Plus, when BRICS member states were actually meeting with the countries or with representatives of the countries which would like to become part of the BRICS mechanism. And it was very important meeting for all the dignitaries there, because it was a groundwork, a laying of groundwork for something that they're already labeling as a new world order, multipolar world order, and this is something that the almost entire global south is striving for.
So this was the first summit of the expanded BRICS, as you've alluded to that. So what was the focus of the new African members?
During the plenary session, we have heard President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, we have heard President of Egypt, Al-Sisi, and we have heard President of Ethiopia talking to the people gathered there at the plenary session. And what all of them were saying is that they would like to see more engagement of Africa into the world mechanisms, into the international governance, into the world funding. So Africa would like to have more role, better role, bigger role in the world, and that was the key element of what African leaders were telling, and not just them who were talking at the plenary session. We have heard a number of other African leaders mentioning almost the same: access to the funding, African solutions for African problems, as you mentioned, and of course more representation of Africa in international bodies like United Nations, like International Monetary Fund.
So this is the voice of the Global South, and I do want to get a little bit more of an understanding from you, Alyosha, on this agenda of the new world order. What did that mean exactly?
In the first place, multipolar world, meaning that there will be no one place in the world from which all the events around the globe will be dictated, that every single region will have its own rights to resolve its own problems and to deal with its own development. For Africa, it means, in the first place, is that Africa would like to start doing more in the levels of the economy, that it should move forward from just exporting the raw materials into beginning to produce a final product. And this is something that African leaders here were actually talking about and would like to see more of NDB involvement, which is a new development bank, a BRICS bank, which will need to help more African countries in developing its own infrastructure and more production facilities, because Africa doesn't need what happened in the past many dozens of years just to be exporter of raw materials and importer of final products with almost no taxes. Africa would like to see itself being more of a production hub and produce more in the beginning for Africans and then for exporting around the globe. And this is something we heard from a number of politicians that came from Africa and attending Kazan summit.
Well, thank you for those insights, Alyosha. Well, joining me now to unpack the 2024 BRICS Summit are from Cape Town, Sanusha Naidu, BRICS expert and political analyst at the Institute of Global Dialogue, and in Nairobi, Professor Fadel Kabub, Professor of Economics at Denison University and President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Welcome all to the program. I want to start off by getting your thoughts on the just concluded summit, because an expanded BRICS Summit has just concluded in Kazan in Russia. Let's start this discussion by getting your key takeaways from the summit. Sanusha.
I think it was historic in a sense, because as you rightly pointed out, it was the first summit of the new members that have been invited to join, and that included Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. We do know that Saudi Arabia hasn't formally declared that it has joined the BRICS. It still sits in the BRICS as an observer member of sort, and of course Argentina declined. And I think what is interesting about the BRICS summit that we just saw is that the 16th summit actually opens up this area of new cooperation. And in terms of that new cooperation, I think we looked at a lot of these common interests around how do you foster greater collaboration, greater synergy around trade and investment. What is some of the key takeaways for me, I think, was the kind of questions around the BRICS payment system, using localized currencies in order for the BRICS payment system to smooth out and facilitate greater integration of the BRICS in the financial system, the issue around economic resilience towards sanctions. I mean, these are key areas for the kind of financial issues that the BRICS in itself wants to also look at in terms of some of the dynamics that we saw. And on that front, I think it's important to recognize that in terms of the 2009 and before, when these countries were coming together, particularly Brazil, India, Russia, and China coming together around the currency question, it's not new. And I think in that way, the idea of a kind of clearinghouse around the currency, the question of the kind of issues that will have an interbank kind of system, these all take time. And I think this is important to recognize that the BRICS is not there to create the alternative, but is to actually build on and make the current architecture, to transform it to become inclusive. And I think that's important. I think the other big takeaway for me is that the recognition of peace and stability, which is critical to the agenda of economic governance and transformation.
Right. Professor Kabub, the key highlights for you.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. I mean, the first thing that's important to highlight here is just the symbolic nature of this meeting in Russia, which is to say that, given the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and the explicit attempt by the US and Western Europe in particular to isolate Russia, the optics of this meeting was just the exact opposite. That Russia was not isolated. Russia was actually part of a much larger global majority, economically speaking, that is actually thinking about a new vision for a multipolar world. That's the first thing. The second thing is about the meeting itself and the vision that BRICS is putting forward. To be very honest, the aspiration is there. The clarity of vision is not necessarily there in terms of the practical steps that need to be made in order to create this new multipolar world order. The steps necessary to truly de-dollarize the global economy is not completely there, and I'm happy to elaborate on what that means. And then from an African perspective, yes, the African continent is increasingly more visible and present within the BRICS system, but we don't see yet an African vision of how to use its new economic relationship with the BRICS blocs in order to truly transform the African continent. The aspirations are there, but the practical steps are still missing.
So I want you to elaborate a little bit, Professor Kabub, on that specific issue of the aspiration is there, because BRICS was holding its 16th summit to date. Over the last 16 years, how much progress and in which areas has progress been made?
A lot of the focus is on the currency that will replace the dollar. And I would argue that the currency is the least important component of the de-dollarization process, because to have your own currency is is important, but it doesn't really do the hard work of structural transformation. Kenya, for example, has its own currency. It doesn't mean that it has a high degree of monetary sovereignty or economic sovereignty. So for the African continent in particular, we've been assigned a particular role since colonial times, and unfortunately we still play this role to this day. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play this role. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output from the global north. In our large consumer markets, we still play that role. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation and job creation, but effectively it locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. So these three colonial roles are still played by the African continent. So until BRICS recognizes that it needs to undo these structural colonial traps, the process of de-dollarization cannot happen. And that's why the missing part of the BRICS vision is a true industrial policy, joint industrial policy, that will completely transform the economic role of the entire bloc.
We're going to talk about de-dollarization a little bit more in this program. But first, I want to come back to you, Sanusha, and talk about the issue of security, which you alluded on in your opening statement, because building an inclusive world has been President Xi Jinping's top priority. And at the summit, President Xi asked member states to build BRICS for peace and act as guardians of common security. Why is this call by President Xi particularly significant against the backdrop of global insecurities?
Well, I think firstly, it aligns to President Xi Jinping's and China's global vision and framework called the Global Security Initiative, which is then part of a three-prong approach with the Global Development Initiative and the Global Civilization Initiative. And of course, the theme of the summit that we had in Kazan was around politics and security, economics, and of course, culture and the civilizational dynamics. So these are important dynamics in the context of what China is putting forward at the global level, also endorsed by the UN, by the United Nations and Antonio Guterres as the General Secretary. And they see these as pivots in the international system. And so I think what you have to realize is that in the international system today, when we talk about stability and we talk about stability being critical to the kind of economic architecture you want to have, part of this is not just conflict that happens in terms of what we see as traditional forms of conflict, which has now become much more brutalized in the way that war is conducted. But if you think about the African continent, you actually have a lot of intrastate conflict that is built out of the lack of inclusion into the political body of the state, a lack of inclusion of people's rights, and conflict that comes in through what some argue as new security threats, whether it's climate change, whether it's issues around cross-border challenges, issues around resources.
Right, so I want to continue on this multilateralism issue for a little bit. And Professor Kaboub, a joint communique was issued at the end of the summit, and it affirmed that we now live in a multipolar world because other new centers of power have emerged. Which centers of power have emerged, and do you agree that we now live in a multipolar world?
No, we're not in a multipolar world yet, and I would argue that no multipolar world can be born without the African continent being repositioned away from the bottom of the global hierarchy, economic and geopolitical hierarchy. A multipolar world can only exist with Africa being at the center of a new multipolar world. So that repositioning of Africa requires industrialization, requires development. And when we talk about industrialization, unfortunately, most countries and most people think industrial policies at the national level. And that is not going to succeed because our countries are small and don't have what we call economies of scale, which is required for industrialization. But as regional blocks on the continent, or as a continent as a whole, we are the size of China. We do have the economies of scale necessary to industrialize. We have all the critical minerals that we need to truly industrialize and dominate the industries of the 21st century. We have the youngest labor force on the planet. What we're missing is technological partnership, sharing of technology, transfer of technology to manufacture and deploy at scale the building blocks of development and prosperity, starting with an energy system, starting with clean cooking infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure to connect our economies. That is the missing part of the BRICS conversation. And again, it's within reach because all the BRICS countries, the major BRICS countries, have the technology, the manufacturing capability that they can share and transfer with regional blocks on the African continent. With that transformation, we can reposition the African continent at the center of a new multipolar world where we can become the arbiters of peace and security and development and cooperation and an international, under a new international economic order. That is the missing part.
All right, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we will look at what some of the BRICS Summit outcomes mean for Africa. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Sanusha Naidu and Professor Fadel Kaboub. Now, before the break, we looked at some of the outcomes of the BRICS Summit. Let's now look at whether they provide solutions to some of Africa's challenges. Professor Kaboub, Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for an alternative international payment system. What are the regular concerns for developing countries when it comes to the current international financial architecture?
From a global South perspective, from an African perspective, this global economic architecture was not designed by us, was not designed for us. It was designed during colonial times for colonial purposes. And colonial purposes were extractive, abusive, hierarchical. They were not designed for development or justice or SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, or even democracy, right? So why do we expect all of our goals today to be achieved under such architecture? Point number two is the reminder that the sanctions on the Russian economy have produced, which is within a matter of hours, essentially any country can be isolated economically from the entire world and can suffer severe consequences. So that prompted all of these discussions about building the alternative economic architecture, which includes an international payment system that's not susceptible to sanctions and isolation. But what we're discovering now, and I think this is really the main hurdle for BRICS to deal with, is that a payment system in and of itself doesn't give you full economic sovereignty and independence and protection, because it's one thing to make a payment for an international trade transaction. It's another thing to ship it. It's another thing to pay for insurance to deliver it. It's another thing to produce the actual building blocks of development and prosperity, meaning investing in food sovereignty, at least at the regional level, investing in energy sovereignty, and investing in technological sovereignty, so you're not dependent technologically on resources from outside your regional bloc. That's what the multipolar world needs. It needs these strategic transformative investments that truly strengthen your economic and monetary sovereignty, not simply the payment system or the currency itself.
Sanusha, I want to get your view here on that alternative international payment system. What advantages would this platform provide for intra-BRICS trade and particularly countries of the global South?
Well, I think it's part of what Prof said, and it also includes the idea that it will have some level of defraying of transactional costs. I think if you're going to use the currencies at a bilateral level in terms of localized of payment systems, then of course it's things that you could use to buy, for example, in the currency between what they call currency swaps. But I also think that, you know, one of the things that struck me about this summit when they spoke about a kind of payment system, Africa does have one kind of payment system which the BRICS can learn from, and that is the Pan-African payment system. And that's in existence long before the BRICS came into this kind of organized architecture that we're speaking about. And this is something that can actually play a critical role, because Africa's role in the context of regional economic integration has a longer history, and it has longer kinds of frameworks. And I think what we're really kind of needing to do here in this context is to actually start finding what are the cohesive units that can actually be a strategy that you take with countries like South Africa, including Nigeria, Algeria, and of course Uganda as partner countries, and whichever other countries, including Egypt and Ethiopia as full members. These are things that need to start developing that strategy, because I think then you'll have to find the mechanisms to go forward. So on the one hand, yes, it helps. On the other hand, it will take a while. And that's something we have to understand in terms of the structure of way financial systems work. It will take a while. And I think for the moment, the idea that the dollar is going to be de-dollarized or we don't want to use it, it's not necessarily that. I think it's a way in which you find the kind of backdoor trap that you take yourself into that space and you try and lessen what is the financial transaction costs for your economy.
So let me come back to you, Professor Kabub, on the question of de-dollarization, as you alluded to earlier, because de-dollarization is a key priority for BRICS countries. Why does this seem particularly urgent at this moment, and how much progress has actually been made in the search for an alternative currency of trade?
It's really about the real economic productive capacity of countries involved in this trade. I mean, today you can have trade between Kenya and Uganda, for example. What will be the basis of this trade? Kenya will export coffee to Uganda, and Uganda will export coffee to Kenya. But both countries need to import wheat. Both countries need to import technology. Both countries need to import maize. And this is where the continent as a whole, not having food sovereignty, means that we can't de-dollarize our economy yet. So the strategic investments in producing the core crops on the continent, the strategic investments to produce the renewable energy potential that we have on the continent, and to industrialize, to become countries that actually have technological capabilities to produce high value-added content. Once you do those three core components, you've already de-dollarized your economy. And you can start using any regional currency you want, whether it's BRICS or whether African currencies. So that's why I say the process of de-dollarization requires strategic investments and cooperation. And that's why I proposed for a while now a Pan-African industrial policy, what I call a $0 industrial policy, because we have all the resources that we need as a continent.
Right.
But if we have a partner from the BRICS, such as China, for example,
right,
that will share its technology as in joint venture for this joint industrial policy, you need $0 for the industrial policy. And once you start manufacturing and deploying the building blocks of development and prosperity, and once you start investing in food sovereignty, which doesn't require external financing, then you've already de-dollarized your economy and you can move forward with a higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty.
Right. Sanusha, on that issue of alternative currency of trade, and if I do go back to Johannesburg in 2023, you know, the BRICS finance ministers and central bank directors were mandated to look for these alternative trade platforms and currencies, but that mandate has been extended in Kazan. Why is that? How much work has so far been done in this regard?
Well, that was what the New Development Bank was supposed to have come back with a report on what they were tasked at the Johannesburg Summit to look at that very issue around the use of localized currencies. And I think that it tells you that it's not a process that can happen in a year. It's a long-term process, and there are many different structural conditions and issues that need to be addressed, as Prof had alluded to. And I think the challenge really now is, as much as we are talking about what the BRICS is doing and how the BRICS is trying to, as a grouping, as a fora, trying to recontextualize and reconfigure some of these issues around the international financial payment system, it also requires us in Africa to start thinking about what are we doing in the context of the ACFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is really around the trade, the investment, and more importantly, I think, in many of these articulations and iterations of where we are in the context of the continent, we have these Africa +1 summits. So if we are going to start thinking about that Pan-African approach to where we want to create, not just the question of what is currency markets, but what is the question around structural economic transformation of your architecture. And remember that the BRICS is one fora. You've got the G20 coming. And the G20 now will include the African Union. And the G20 is very much about the reform of the international financial architecture as well, around taxation, around product mispricing, illicit financial flows. All of that is investment that leaves the continent and should be able to be plugged so that we can create that kind of structural transformative investment into the sectors that take us into that economic architecture of autonomy.
Right, so I'm going to get your final remarks, and let me start off with you, Professor Kabu, because with more talks about expanding the group to include other emerging economies, what does the future hold for BRICS?
Well, there's a clear imbalance that's building up within the new BRICS system, which is still the dominance of major countries within BRICS. And the newcomers are coming to an existing mechanism that already has an agenda that's in motion. And it doesn't mean that we disagree with the agenda as new members of the BRICS, but we're not part of the structural transformation vision that is required for repositioning the African continent. And part of the blame is to be put on the African countries that did not do their homework and pre-design their own structural transformation and enter within BRICS, enter within the G20 with a vision of transformation and with a set of demands for cooperation and partnership. It's as if we're expecting BRICS to come fix the African continent or the G20 to come fix the African continent. It's just not going to happen. This is our responsibility to design our own vision. And if you don't have a long-term strategic vision for yourself, I guarantee you're already part of somebody else's strategic vision, whether it's BRICS or G20 or any other economic bloc. So that's really the responsibility is in our hands as Africans, especially the African Union, to convene a conversation about the structural transformation needed on our terms, and then move forward with our partners so that we can actually have true partnership that's transformative, that's a win-win for everybody.
Sanusha, your thoughts?
Well, I think, as the BRICS moves forward, we're going to have to see how this expansion actually gets defined in practice. We haven't really seen much around what the criteria guidelines are. We don't know to what extent there'll be a next kind of invitation for countries that are now considered as partner countries that have been added to the BRICS will be joining as full members. But one of the areas I think is going to be very complex for the BRICS going forward, I think they agree in principle on the issues regarding what needs to be reformed of the global governance economic agenda, and of course in terms of the broader global governance agenda with multilateral institutions. But what I think is going to be a critical pivot in the BRICS that needs to be taken into consideration is, as new members, and in particular with the new members that have joined now, I think you're going to have a lot of interesting intra-BRICS competition. And if you look at Egypt, Ethiopia, UAE, Iran, etc., you kind of seeing that already play out in the Horn of Africa. And I think with countries like UAE coming in, they also have very, very big and broad and very ambitious visions and want to see themselves strategically also shaping some of these dynamics that the BRICS talks about in the financial system and so forth. But key to this is whether the BRICS is going to be able to find its traction around a peace and security agenda.
All right, very insightful discussion there indeed. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Sanusha Naidu, BRICS expert and political analyst at the Institute of Global Dialogue, and Professor Fadel Kabu, Professor of Economics at Denison University and President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Remember, you can be part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep this conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, bye-bye.